Good evening, everyone. Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who has come to us from Tucson, Arizona, Dr. Luz A. And I'll tell you just a little bit about her, and then she'll give the lecture of One Health. Dr. DeWitt is a veterinarian, got her veterinarian degree from UNAM, the premier university in Mexico. She then went to Tufts University and got a master's in conservation medicine, so medicine on animals that we think about for conservation. That wasn't enough, so then she went to University of California, Santa Cruz, and earned a doctorate in ecology and evolution, focusing on infectious diseases and zoonotic diseases, which she'll tell you more about. And from there, she went to Vermont to engage a postdoc, research on the same topic. And now she is working with us for a year in the Honors College on integrated minors, and she also is working on a postdoc at Notre Dame University. So a very incredibly accomplished young scientist who I'm very excited to have share her work with you tonight. Liz?
Can everybody hear me if I'm away from the microphone? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia, for that introduction. And thank you all so much for being here. It's very exciting to see so many people interested in learning about One Health. And just to get a kind of a feel of the room and see where everyone stands, who here had heard of One Health prior to the announcement of my talk? Just raise your hands. It's also known as planetary health, so maybe you've heard of that. Okay, so that's good. Not a lot of you have heard of One Health, so hopefully for most of you, this talk will be an introduction into the concept of One Health and the practical applications of One Health. And for those of you who have heard of One Health, I've included a couple of examples from my work. Some of them are not published yet, so hopefully everybody will learn something new from today. So probably one of the most pressing scientific questions of this century is, how do we improve human health while conserving biodiversity and improving animal welfare? In other words, how do we eradicate poverty? How do we eradicate hunger and reduce the burden of diseases while without needing to convert more forests into cropland, without needing to reduce biodiversity further, and without increasing animal suffering and disease? So I know it's probably quite a loaded question. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. But what I can say is that over the last 2 decades, scientists around the world have been tackling questions exactly like these using the One Health approach. So One Health focuses on studying or solving issues that are found at the interface of human health, animal health, and environmental health. And it's usually depicted as a Venn diagram with 3 circles like the ones in this slide, each circle representing all of the health, so animal health, human health, and environmental health. And all of the areas in which those circles intersect, that's prime area for One Health. As I mentioned earlier, One Health is also known as planetary health or conservation medicine. And so a key characteristic of studies or projects related to One Health is the collaboration between scientists of multiple disciplines. And it's not just physicians, veterinarians, and ecologists. One Health projects benefit from collaborations among scientists of multiple disciplines, like social scientists, statisticians, epidemiologists, environmental scientists, as well as scientists that you would never think of putting together in a single room or in a single call. And one of the main goals of having all of these scientists working together on a One Health topic is to communicate their findings, their results to people or entities that can actually make a difference. So people that own lands, or policymakers, or voters, and also communicate the results to people that could be affected positively or negatively by changes in land use or by changes in policies related to One Health topics. So there are multiple dimensions of One Health. Some One Health topics include infectious diseases, which include zoonotic diseases, which are the diseases that are transmitted between animals and humans. Other topics related to antibiotic resistance. Other topics that are not related at all with infectious disease, like food safety and food security, mental health, environmental health, domestic animal and wildlife conflict, and technological innovations around the environmental, human, and animal health, which I'll try to get to at the end of this talk. And so for the next 20-30 minutes, I will be telling you about 3 studies that I've worked on that are grounded in the One Health concept. And all of them are related to infectious diseases, most of them to zoonotic diseases. But each of them touch on different angles of One Health. So I will be talking about the wildlife trade. I'll be talking about introduced species and eradication of invasive species. And I will be talking about how we can quantify the environmental and health benefits of eradicating or controlling the major helminth infections. Just as a disclaimer, these are studies that are pretty long and complex, so I've condensed them into a couple of slides each, not a couple, but a few slides each. So if there's anything that's not clear, please feel free to just raise your hand and interrupt me and ask me questions if there's something that's not clear. So for the first study, I got together with an ecologist and 2 economists, as if 1 economist wasn't enough. And we got together about 3 months after the first case of COVID-19 came out in the news, and about 3 weeks after the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. And for us, and for many people around the world, this pandemic, or this virus, seemed very similar to the SARS epidemic, to the SARS virus that emerged in 2002, both in terms of the pathogen, which both are coronaviruses, and as well as the origin, because both are associated with the wildlife trade. So, like many people around the world, we were kind of frustrated that things like this were still occurring, like the wildlife trade was still occurring, and that pandemics associated with the wildlife trade were still occurring. So we wanted to dig into the proximal causes of the emergence of diseases like this. So we decided to work on a study looking at the economic drivers of the wildlife trade and try to see if those economic drivers could help explain the emergence of diseases like COVID-19, SARS, as well as other diseases that you may be familiar with, like Ebola. So for those of you who are not that familiarized with the wildlife trade. The wildlife trade is a highly complex supply chain. It's mostly driven, and I'm just showing a very simplified version of the supply chain. And it's mostly driven by the demand for wildlife for bushmeat, which is meat from wildlife, and bushmeat that is consumed rurally, or bushmeat that is consumed at an urban level. It's also driven by the supply of wildlife for traditional medicine, as well as wildlife for ornamental products, research, fur, the pet trade, and trophies. And these products are supplied by wildlife hunters, who then supply these products to wildlife farmers, wildlife dealers, and bushmeat dealers, who then supply their wildlife products to wildlife market sellers, either in small villages or in cities or internationally. And all of this is happening around the world, and there are legal and illegal aspects to the wildlife trade. And there's a lot of gray area in between the legal and the illegal aspect of the wildlife trade. So most of you are probably familiar with the diseases that have been associated with the wildlife trade. Some of them have actually turned into epidemics or pandemics. So HIV, which has been responsible for approximately 36 million deaths, is associated with, or is believed to have originated from consumption or handling of bushmeat. Ebola, that so far has claimed 35,000 deaths, has also been associated with handling and consumption of bushmeat. SARS, which compared to the other four didn't claim that many deaths, but it was a pretty big epidemic because it shut down the whole economy. It is responsible for 774 deaths, and it's associated with wildlife farms and wildlife markets. And COVID-19 has so far claimed 240 million deaths, and it's believed to have originated either from a wildlife market or a wildlife farm. So aside from the impacts of wildlife trade on human health, the wildlife trade has huge impacts on wildlife populations. It's actually considered one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. Tens of millions of animals are traded every year. And these tens of millions of animals correspond to approximately 7,638 different species. So on the graph to your right, you can see in red are the taxa that are typically traded. And most of them are birds and mammals, but also amphibians and reptiles. And these species are already classified as threatened. So they're probably threatened by habitat loss, or by invasive species, or by overexploitation. And another important component, or another important aspect of the wildlife trade, is that animals are typically housed and transported in crowded conditions, as well as pretty inhumane conditions. So that's not only horrendous from an animal welfare perspective, but it also creates ideal conditions for pathogens to emerge. And many of these pathogens that end up emerging can be zoonotic. And so despite the impacts of wildlife trade on human health and on wildlife populations, and despite multiple bans on the wildlife trade, despite billions of dollars on billions of dollars invested on disease prevention and disease surveillance programs, we still see that the wildlife trade persists. And one of the main reasons why the wildlife trade persists is, well, it's actually pretty simple, because the wildlife trade has enormous benefits to millions of people. So the wildlife trade is an important source of protein or bushmeat for millions of people, especially people that do not have access to domestic animal meat. The wildlife trade is also an important source of income for millions of people, whether legal or illegal. It's also an important component of people's culture. It's part of traditional medicine, and it also provides social status. It's also associated with illegal activities that are pretty difficult to eradicate in of themselves, like drug and armed trafficking. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the wildlife trade, it's worth approximately $45 billion annually. And just to give you an idea of how much that is, it's equivalent to the GDP of the country Jordan. And Jordan, the country Jordan doesn't rank low in GDPs. There are 100 countries below GDPs, below Jordan. So the wildlife trade is worth more than the GDP of many countries. So clearly there's a mismatch between the costs and benefits of the wildlife trade. The stakeholders or people that are negatively affected by the wildlife trade are not necessarily the same stakeholders or people that are that benefit from the wildlife trade. So for this study, we compared those mismatches in costs and benefits, but we compare them across different stakeholder classes. We compared them across individuals, wildlife hunters, and wildlife sellers. We compare them across nations, particularly China and Liberia, which is where SARS and Ebola have emerged, and COVID-19 for China. And we compared them across the world. And in terms of costs, we included the costs of the productivity loss due to disease. So the lost income due to illness and the lost GDP due to disease in a country or in the world. We also included the costs of treating diseases. And in terms of benefits, we included the income that people or nations or the world derive from wildlife trade. And we also included nutritional benefits from the wildlife trade. And so here I'm going to show you the results for this cost-benefit analysis. But first, I want to guide you through the graph because it's a pretty busy graph. You're going to see, I'm going to show you the costs and benefits for COVID-19, SARS, and Ebola. First, I'm going to show you the ones for SARS and Ebola. And on the x-axis, you're going to see costs and benefits for each stakeholder class. So at an individual level, national level, and global level. And that dashed line in the middle at the level of 0, that line represents the point in which the costs are equal to the benefits. So everything above that line are the benefits, which are going to be colored in blue and represent the benefits associated with the wildlife trade. And everything below the line represents the costs in red. So for SARS and Ebola, the benefits of the wildlife trade outweigh the costs at all scales. And that's marked by the solid gray line at the top of the bar. That's the point, that's the value, the net benefit value of the wildlife trade, the benefits of the wildlife trade. So at each scale, the benefits outweigh the costs. Now, for COVID-19, we found that the costs of the wildlife trade outweigh the benefits of COVID-19, but only at individual and national scales. At global scales, the costs of COVID-19 outweighed the benefits by $23.3 billion per year. So what does this mean from a policy perspective? It means that the world is willing to pay $23.3 billion to prevent a pandemic like COVID-19. But who will the world pay those $23.3 billion? So ideally, they would pay those stakeholders that would, for whom the benefits of the wildlife trade outweigh the costs of these pandemics. So they would pay the individual stakeholders, and they would pay the national stakeholders. And the way that these payments could be done, they wouldn't be done like through checks and like, here you go, here goes your money. They would be done in theory by the creation of alternative livelihoods, alternative sources of protein, alternative sources of food, and it would be done through NGOs or government agencies that are already equipped to do these type of work. So now I'm going to switch gears to the second case study. In this study, this is a study that I did. This is one of my dissertation chapters. And in this study, I looked at the combined the dual benefits of eradicating invasive species from islands. And those dual benefits include biodiversity and public health benefits. So I worked with in this chapter with other biologists, ecologists, veterinarians, and epidemiologists, and our goal was to see whether eradicating invasive species, which is done usually as a conservation measure, could also benefit human health. And so, invasive species, just like wildlife trade, they are one of the most important drivers of biodiversity loss. When non-native species are introduced into a different habitat, into their non-native habitat, they can outcompete native species, sometimes driving them to extinction, and sometimes, most of the times, not substituting for the functions that these species perform in their native habitats. Native species from islands are particularly vulnerable to invasive species, and this is because native species from islands have evolved without the pressure from those species, and they have evolved without defenses against predation mostly. And so species from islands islands are actually biodiversity hotspots, but they are also extinction hotspots because approximately invasive species have been introduced to approximately 1,000 islands worldwide, and they are responsible for more than 14% of bird, mammal, and reptile extinctions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because islands are closed systems and they are isolated from the mainland, invasive species can actually be eradicated as a measure to protect native species. And so, together with the group of collaborators, we were interested in seeing if eradicating invasive species could actually result in public health benefits. And for this, we focused on invasive cats. Sorry for all of you who have cats at home. Domestic cats are the second most common introduced predator in islands. And cats are also reservoirs for a pathogen that's called Toxoplasma gondii. Who here has heard of toxoplasmosis? Or So Toxoplasma gondii or toxoplasmosis, well, Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite that is only transmitted or maintained by cats and other felids. And people can be exposed to the parasite and can develop disease, especially women who are exposed during pregnancy. They can have miscarriage, or babies can be born with congenital defects. And it's also been associated with mental disorders. So because the majority of islands do not have native felids, and a lot of islands have invasive cats, and invasive cats are the only reservoirs of Toxoplasma gondii in islands, we figured that eradicating invasive cats would locally eliminate Toxoplasma gondii and would locally eliminate the source of exposure to people that live on islands. So to actually answer this question, if cat eradications can result in public health benefits, we focused on a set of islands located in Mexico, in the Baja California Peninsula. And this set of islands is actually ideal for asking this question exactly, because these 7 islands are all inhabited by humans, but the islands that are colored in red are the islands where cats are present, and the islands that are colored in blue are islands that do not have cats. So El Pardito, which is the island located on the Gulf side of the peninsula, is an island that has never had cats. And Natividad is an island located on the Pacific side of the peninsula, used to have cats, but they were eradicated in the year 2000 because in an effort to control the populations of black-vented shearwaters. Black-vented shearwaters are seabirds that breed on islands, and 90% of the world population of black-vented shearwaters breed in Natividad. And their population was being basically hammered by predation from invasive cats. So cats were eradicated from Natividad in the year 2000. And so, again, I'm going to show you the results from this study, and I'm going to guide you first through the graphs. So I'm going to show you I should have mentioned earlier. So when we visited these islands, we collected blood samples from people of all ages, and we measured the prevalence of toxoplasmosis. So we measured the proportion of people that have been exposed to the parasite. We did this by determining whether people had antibodies against the parasite in their blood. And so here I'm going to show you the results across the cat treatments. So I'm going to show you first the results of prevalence of toxoplasmosis across age groups in the islands with cats. And so on the y-axis, you'll see the prevalence, which is a proportion or percentage. And on the x-axis, you'll see the age classes that we sampled. So for the islands with cats, we found a positive linear trend, which is normal for diseases like this. For El Pardito, the island that has never had cats, we found that none of the inhabitants had been exposed to Toxoplasma gondii. And for Natividad, which is the island where cats were eradicated in 2000, we found not only that the prevalence of toxoplasmosis was significantly lower than that of the other islands with cats, but we found something really interesting, that the children that were born after cats were eradicated had zero exposure to the parasite. So this study has gained a lot of attraction, particularly in the conservation sector, and it has increased support for conservation action, particularly for NGOs that are focused on conserving native species on islands. In fact, through this study, I was able to collaborate on another study, or collaborate with Island Conservation, which is an NGO that focuses on eradicating invasive species. And together we worked on a study looking at the potential for island nations to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through eradication. So not only focusing on the human health and biodiversity benefits, but other benefits that people can derive from eradicating cats. So increased tourism because the native species bounce back, creation of jobs, water sanitation, reduced poverty because it would give people jobs and it would build capacity on people for tourism or for doing these type of work, this type of works. And here I'm just presenting you the references for these papers, and I'm giving you my email at the end in case you're interested in learning more about these studies. So shifting gears one more time. Right now I'm going to talk to you about this third study that I'm currently working on as a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame. And for this study, I'm working with economists, ecologists, and agricultural economists that I didn't know they existed. And together we are working on quantifying the human health and environmental benefits of controlling or eradicating the major human helminth infections. So human helminth infections are generally classified as soil-transmitted infections, which include the roundworms, hookworms, whipworms, and water-transmitted helminths, which include the schistosomas. Approximately 1.5 billion people around the world are infected with helminths, and most of these people are concentrated in low-income countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and in Asia. And although these helminths can infect people of all ages, they tend to have more severe impacts on children of school-age children and pregnant women. And this is because these helminths can cause severe anemia, wasting, and stunting. Our body, our immune system, generally doesn't do a good job at clearing these infections. It usually takes several years for the human body to actually clear helminth infections. So the best way to treat these infections is through anti-helminthic drugs. And as an effort, as a public health intervention, the World Health Organization for several decades now has been trying to control these infections by treating the populations that where these parasites are present, and that's known as mass drug administration. So the only disadvantage of this is that it's pretty expensive to actually implement mass drug administration, even though the costs of treating each person are actually relatively low. Cost per treatment ranges from $1 to $3. But for these, for MDA or mass drug administration campaigns to be effective, they actually have to cover at least 75% of the population of the country or the community where the parasite or the parasites are present. The other risk to mass drug administration is the potential for parasites to develop resistance against these drugs. So to control these major human helminth infections, this would be the ideal solution, and we know the costs. So what are the potential benefits of controlling the major helminth infections? So these parasites are macroparasites. They can be pretty big. They can be as long as, well, they can be very many centimeters or meters long. And the reason why they cause wasting and stunting is because they compete with their host, with humans, directly for food or for blood. They also, because of the immune response and the inflammatory response, they also, the human body requires a lot of calories, a lot of energy to combat these parasites. If you consider that every person that is infected has between 1 and 100, if not more, parasites inside their bodies, and if you consider that these parasites are competing with people for food or for blood, well, that's a lot of energy that's being wasted on parasites, particularly if we consider that at least 1.5 billion people are infected. So potentially, controlling 1.5 billion helminth infections can reduce the amount of energy, calories, or in this case, food, being wasted on parasites. So if we were to scale up the amount of food waste that could be reduced, we might be able to get to an amount of hectares of forest not being converted into agriculture. Obviously, the human health benefits of controlling these helminth infections are quite obvious. By controlling these infections, we would reduce the mortality and morbidity associated with disease. And this is usually measured as disability-adjusted life years, which take into account the years of life lost due to disease, which is equivalent to mortality, and the years lived with disability, which is equivalent to morbidity. Now, there are ways to turn these metrics into dollars. Another benefit of controlling these helminth infections is that we would obviously increase the quality of life of people that would normally be infected. We will increase their productivity. Children that are stunted or have wasting because of these diseases do really poor in school. And because they do really poor in school, they end up being very unproductive in labor later in their years. So that turns into a poverty disease trap that we might be able to break by controlling these infections. And so just like in the wildlife trade study that I talked to you about, we are taking an economic approach to measure the potential benefits of implementing mass drug administration. And we're including the potential amount of food not going to waste, reduce the food wasted to parasites. We're incorporating the DALIs, which is that metric that I told you about that incorporates mortality and morbidity. And we're subtracting those two to the costs of mass drug administration. And so I'm currently working on this project, and I don't have final results to show you, but I'm going to show you some preliminary results. First, I'm going to show you by country the amount of food that we can reduce through mass drug administration. So you can see that for the countries where these parasites are present, we can save from $200 to $800 million. In terms of DALIs, in the countries that where the parasites are endemic or present, we can save up to from $2,000 to to $10 billion. And so these two compared to the cost of MDA, which range from $100 to $500 million, we can see that for several countries, the benefits of mass drug administration outweigh the cost of mass drug administration, especially for countries with a large population size that has a high prevalence of these parasites, like Brazil and India. And so in terms of policy, these results, first we have to obviously incorporate any additional environmental benefits that can result from mass drug administration, including the number of hectares that could be conserved that are not being transformed into agriculture. But so far, we can see that for most countries, the benefits of mass drug administration outweigh their costs, mostly by reducing food waste, by reducing mortality, and by reducing morbidity. So at the end, these results may be able to inform large stakeholders like regions or rich countries. They would provide them with a willingness to pay to invest in public health policies that can help reduce the morbidity, mortality, as well as amount of food being wasted in countries where these parasites are endemic. And so just want to hopefully take some, have you guys leave with some take-home messages that One Health projects or One Health studies benefit greatly by the work of inter and multidisciplinary teams. And this is mostly because they make the results much more robust, and because they make the results more available and they can reach a wider audience. One Health has a lot of potential to inform public health interventions, public policy or policymakers, governments, and stakeholders at multiple scales. And as One Health practitioners, we have the responsibility to make sure that as policies are being changed, there is not an unfair distribution in the impacts of those policies. So if you remember from the wildlife trade study, if there were to be a policy that effectively regulates the wildlife trade, we must be sure that stakeholders that lose from this policy have an alternative. And another important aspect about One Health is that, and about working in multidisciplinary teams, is that it opens people to new perspectives, new approaches, and to new technologies. And before I finish, I would just like to leave you with this idea. So I talked about eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, about finding alternative food sources, about converting less forests into agriculture. And that's all great in print or in writing, but so far we haven't found a way to actually implement or actually reduce poverty, eradicate hunger, and all of that. But only recently, the USDA just invested $10 million in a lab at Tufts University that works on lab-grown meat. Has anybody here heard of lab-grown meat? Great. So it's probably going to take a while for lab-grown meat to actually get out there, but it definitely has a lot of potential to provide alternatives to animal consumption. It has a lot of potential for reducing animal suffering. It has a lot of implications for animal welfare. It has a lot of potential for reducing greenhouse emissions. and also has a lot of potential to reduce the risk of zoonotic disease emergence. So I would just like to leave you with that idea as food for thought, and no pun intended. And with that, I would just like to thank you for your time and take any questions. Yes?
In one of the earlier slides, you said how most countries' NDA benefits outweigh the costs of
Yes.
reducing waste usage and stuff like that. I was wondering if by those most countries, are you talking about developing countries, or does that include places like the US and Japan?
No, actually, only for this study, I left out all of the high-income countries, mostly because these parasites are not present in they're not endemic or present in the majority of high-income countries, but also because the prevalence of these parasites tends to be overestimated in high-income countries, because you have one or two studies that find that 5% of the study population is infected, but you can't extrapolate and think that in the US 5% of people have schistosomiasis, because that's just not true. So I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah? Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate your focus on interdisciplinary work, and I really like the graph, the tried diagram that you showed us. I'm wondering how you might see the humanities fitting into that, if at all.
The humanities?
Yes.
Oh, they play a huge role, especially in the human, like all the interface, the human health, or the areas where human health interfaces with the other two circles. I've had to work a lot with social scientists, with economists, with anthropologists, and I think, yeah, well, they play a really important role in terms of working on proposals for new policies, as well as designing studies. Like, a lot of these studies require applying questionnaires to communities, and you definitely need a social scientist for studies like that. And there's so much room for social science in One Health. Yeah. Yes.
So there's a relationship with COVID-19 with environmental destruction and health and food waste and all those things. Coming out of this pandemic, do you think we'll see major changes in infrastructure to actually solve those issues?
I really hope so. I don't know if you followed the news, right during the pandemic, because people were all locked up and people started being more exposed to nature. A lot of studies came out right around that time, or because of that time, because we started noticing that people obtain a lot of benefits from nature, not only tangible resources like food and fuel and all of that, but also spiritual fulfillment or recreation. And so a lot of studies came out, especially related to mental health. And I'm trying not to go out too much on a tangent, but what your question made me think of all of the mental health studies that came out because of the pandemic, and it kind of, especially it reached out to a new audience, the importance of not keeping nature intact, because that's pretty impossible, but to trying to reach an equilibrium in terms of how we interact with nature. So I unfortunately don't have an answer to that. I can't say that things will be better, but things, even now, like it's in the middle of the epidemic, it's hard to say it, but things are getting better. Things have been getting better since the 1990s. things always tend to get better, but we just sometimes focus on the years around us, and it makes us think that we're doing worse. And I think with technologies, with the advancement of technologies, we'll be able to hopefully get to that point. Yes?
Thanks, Luz, for a really great talk. And I really appreciate your examples and sort of how to work in this space. So I teach a global health course in the Honors College, and One Health is a great way to kind of think about, especially from a sustainable development perspective, like more inclusively about health outcomes. I now teach a social determinants of health class where we're looking at health issues in the U.S. and I'm trying to sort of think about applications in the U.S. Setting. One thing that comes to mind is I grew up in North Carolina and we had lots of hog farms, and the intersection between human health and animal health and environmental health, really strong, and issues around environmental justice and health equity. I wonder if you could speak about whether One Health has kind of caught on as a concept, also looking at health issues in the U.S. And maybe some examples of that and how that interfaces with issues around health equity.
Sure. One example that comes to mind is a study that I collaborated on looking at how land use change will impact ecosystem services. So has everybody heard of, or anybody heard of ecosystem services before? So ecosystem services are the benefits that people derive from nature, from water purification to food, to recreation, spiritual fulfillment, regulation of disease, air quality, all sorts of benefits that we can derive from nature. And so with land use change, as counties or states start to become more urbanized, or forests are turning more into agricultural land, we are losing those ecosystem services. And what we found in this study, we projected, so there are projections of land use change into 2100, and we used those projections to see how the ecosystem service benefits would distribute across counties and across states. And we found that counties that have more Blacks and Hispanics and Asian ethnicities, they would receive much less ecosystem service benefits than purely white counties. So this is just one example. I can try to think more about other examples in the US. I know there are a lot of examples of One Health implemented in the US. And another thing that I want to emphasize is that when we talk about One Health, it doesn't necessarily have to include the three healths. It can focus only on the interface between human health and environmental health, or human health and animal health, or just animal health and environmental health. And another example that comes to my mind is the conflicts between grizzlies or mountain lions and domestic animals. There's a lot of work on that in the U.S. But I don't know if I can connect that to social justice or things like that.
I really appreciated at the end your focus on food production, because I think that's where we see a huge intersection here, and including antibiotic resistant pathogens that can come through food and be transmitted sort of through humans, and especially when you look at sort of the cheapest foods often are the most produced and produced in the poorest circumstances and might have different benefits and issues around equity and health outcomes.
Yes, of course.
Along those lines, are there any distinctions made between the prevalence in indigenous versus non-indigenous populations, and particularly in terms of diet and folkways like traditional medicine? Or was it all just sort of lumped?
For the helminths?
Yeah.
These like the prevalence of these diseases, or I should say, these helminths are endemic to countries, low-income countries, and so you're saying like maybe like indigenous people have more, I don't know, like in Latin America, indigenous people have higher prevalence than non-indigenous people.
Yeah, and it works both ways.
Yeah.
Right? With Native American indigenous cultures, there was a lot of fry bread,
Right.
Because
Right.
the army gave them
Right.
lard and flour.
Right. I wouldn't know about in terms of the helminth infections, but these infections are mostly diseases of poor people because they the way that they are transmitted, the reason one of the main routes through transmission is fecal oral. And in places where there's not good infrastructure for managing wastewaters, people end up being exposed to the larval stages of these parasites through their skin, or they drink water that is contaminated with these parasites. So I would say that the people that are more heavily exposed are people that are poorer. But there could be a correlation between that and whether they're indigenous groups or not. But I wouldn't be able to say specifically for these parasites. Yes.
Do you find that NGOs are more comfortable onto the states in terms of solving issues in environmental health? So do states or countries actually want to implement?
Sorry, so you said if I find that NGOs are more what?
Oh, sorry. Do you find that NGOs are more preferable actors than states in terms of solving for issues related to health?
Oh boy, that's
Repeat the question, because I'm sure others did.
so she asked me if I find that NGOs are better actors compared to the state, to governments, in terms for working on these type of problems. It's a really hard question because the problem with many NGOs is that some of them are very small and have very limited funding, and so sometimes, unfortunately, their funding is kind of like a vicious cycle of they have to obtain funding to keep funding themselves. So I've come across many NGOs that you can't see that they're doing that much. But then you look at large NGOs like the Nature Conservancy or Island Conservation or EcoHealth Alliance. Those NGOs have a lot of weight on the public, and they also have good lobbyists, and so people that are working with policymakers or lawmakers. In terms of governments, depends on which government, I guess. Depends on which country. Unfortunately, some governments are not very effective. But yeah, I would say maybe yes. Maybe NGOs are more formidable. Yes, Chris.
I'm not sure exactly how to execute this question. So when I first heard, this is all totally new to me, so when I first heard One Health, I sort of thought, okay, it's simply an integrated way of looking, right?
Yes.
But then the more you spoke, the more I started sort of reframing that as a kind of utilitarian approach, kind of relentlessly utilitarian. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about sort of the significance of the fact that, you know, human health is at the top of our pyramid here. And I mean, it seems to me that sort of an economic utilitarian approach becomes a way of sort of selling animal health or environmental health to people who don't care about those things as goods in themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about how like a One Health practitioner deals with sort of the problem of a situation where, say, increased biodiversity is at odds with human health.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say that for most of my work, I use an economic approach or a utilitarian approach, because coming more from the conservation sector, where we have much less money than in the health sciences or in the health sector, we're usually struggling a lot. So it's becoming ever more often that to see that we show how important it is in terms of money, because usually money is what drives policy, unfortunately, in this world. And if we want funding and we want changes, we need policy to change, and we need governments to fund enforce agencies that enforce wildlife trade. And so, but at the same time, there are other approaches to, and I agree, this is an approach. This is not a discipline. This is just a way of solving or understanding issues that are related to these healths. And I guess because of my background and because I come from the conservation sector, I do look at it from a utilitarian perspective. And but I can say, I'm just going back to that example of mental health, and I was going to say, oh, that's an example in which you don't necessarily take a utilitarian approach, but then I remember those studies, and they use DALYs, and they use monetary. They turned the prevalence of those diseases into actual dollar signs. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of utilitarianism in One Health, at least in the way that I see it. Any other question?
Thank you so much, Luz.
Thank you all so much for your time.